I'm Phoebe, Arslanagić-Wakefield, Senior Researcher at Bright Blue, which is an independent liberal conservative think tank. For those who are tweeting, please use the handle @WeAreBrightBlue and the hashtag BrightBlue. There is now a consensus that council tax is poorly designed. The valuations it is based on having not been updated since the 90s, and that's despite the astronomical boom in house prices we've seen since then, especially in the south. That has led to serious regional imbalances in terms of the burden that council tax presents to taxpayers, surely an important question for the Conservatives in terms of levelling up. Stamp duty also finds itself under discussion. Many economists argue that this tax impedes and distorts housing prices, making it more difficult for homeowners to make the decision to downsize or indeed move up the housing ladder, and slowing down the market. Government tinkering with stamp duty during the pandemic saw wild fluctuations and spikes in the market. A recent report from Bright Blue, authored by Professor Paul Cheshire and Professor Christian Hilber, recommends replacing both council tax and stamp duty with a proportional property tax, which would be a flat rate annual levy on the value of houses. There is a strong base of support within the Conservative Party for the reform of property tax, encapsulated in the Property Research Group led by Kevin Hollinrake MP, and there is also significant cross-party support. But how could such a plan be practically implemented? What benefits and difficulties might there be? What other options for reform are there? Here today to answer and discuss these and more questions, we have our excellent panellists, who I will shortly introduce, and will each give a 5-minute speech on reforming the UK's property taxes. Afterwards, I will get the discussion going, and you will be able to put your questions to our panellists, and that includes those who are watching at home. Please do send in your questions. We'd be delighted to have them. So, today we are joined by Erin Bell MP, who represents Newcastle under Lyme and is a member of the Northern Research Group, Lord Willetts, President of the Resolution Foundation, Anya Martin, Director of PricedOut, Carol Lewis, who is Deputy Property Editor at The Times and The Sunday Times, and Andrew Dixon, Founder and Chair of Fairer Share. Erin, your 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. I'm not going to go into all the details of the proposal. Some of you will know them anyway. I think Andrew's probably going to cover that later. What I'd like to talk a bit about is what levelling up means and how this feeds into levelling up, and a little bit about the politics of the situation. So a lot of people have been asking what levelling up means. It's been something that's struggled a bit of definition. But I represent Newcastle under Lyme, which those of you who don't know, it's the proper Newcastle. It's the one in the Midlands next to Stoke-on-Trent. And so we're in the Midlands, the North Midlands, but actually we share quite a lot in common with the North. It's a red wall seat. Last Tory MP was in 1885. It's been Labour for 100 years. It wasn't the toughest of gains because it only had a Labour majority of 30, so if I'd messed that one up, I don't think I'd ever have been allowed to stand ever again. But it's obvious what levelling up means in Newcastle under Lyme. We are getting a lot of public investment. We've got the Towns Fund, we've got the Future High Streets Fund. Buildings are getting knocked down right now. Hopefully things will be being built in 2022, 2023, and that will be a real evidence that things are changing in the Red Wall, things are changing in the towns, and towns have been long neglected, I think, as people have moved to the cities, the consequences of globalisation and the consequences of more higher education and the brain drain away from places like Newcastle. And I'm not, that's public investment, and I'm a Conservative. I believe in the long run we've got to have the private sector supporting these things. I see this as pump priming, and perhaps an apt time to talk about pump priming, because we have got to boost the local economy. We've got to fix the retail problem with the high street. I've got a market town with a lot of mining villages around it, so you can see why it was Labour. But we have really got to fix the issues in Newcastle with a bit of public love first, and then get the private sector in behind that with science and innovation. I've got a Keele University in my constituency, all of that sort of thing. But levelling up can't just be about firstly, public investment, getting private investment in. Levelling up has to be fairness around the country as well. The regional inequalities that we see, largely as a consequence of the distorting effects of the property market and all the things about globalisation, are long overdue being addressed. And when you look at the fact that someone who owns a £100,000 property, and there are plenty of £100,000 properties in Newcastle under Lyme, the average is probably a little under 200,000, they pay 5 times more as a proportion of the property value than someone who owns a £1 million house down here, down in London. So there is a real unfairness there. The fact that no government's had the courage to revalue council tax even since 1990, in which time property values have soared in the southeast and they haven't really gone up it. There's a real unfairness issue that I think is long overdue for addressing. There's also the intergenerational point. I won't labour it because I'm sure Lord Willetts will speak about that. If you haven't read his book, The Pinch, please do, because we have also got to address that as a party. If we don't start trying to work out how we can treat the younger generation more fairly in these matters, then they're not going to grow up to be conservatives. If you don't have a stake in capital, how are you going to be a capitalist? How are you going to believe in the things that we believe in our party? So it's levelling up is not just about the sort of the things that we hear about, the new buildings, the towns fund. It's about opportunity. It's about opportunity for regions to become dynamic in their own right. And it's about opportunity for individuals to get themselves the skills and the property and the housing that they deserve. Briefly on the stamp duty point, because that's the second part of this, and probably the bit that makes it a bit more palatable to some of the people who would be worse off with a proportional property tax. Stamp duty is a terrible, terrible tax. It really stops people moving where the jobs are. It takes rungs out of the ladder. Why on earth would you move up from a £400,000 house in London to a 600,000 to an 800 to a million? You'll pay an absolute fortune in stamp duty, but you've got no incentive to do what my parents did and move around as you can afford it. What you end up doing is overstretching yourself once, stay there for longer than you ideally would, and then overstretch yourself again. So we should take out that distortion. The politics of it all, I know it's not easy because, we saw in Chesham and Amersham that we have an ever-changing coalition in the Conservative Party. But if not now, when? We've got representation in seats we've never represented before. We're representing lots of people who live in £50,000 houses, £30,000 houses, who are being essentially screwed over by the system. And it's time we did something about that. We can work cross-party, certainly, but what I'd leave my final point on this is, if we don't look at this, if we don't, I'm not saying it's going to be in the next manifesto, but if we don't look at this and the Labour Party get there first, how are we going to argue against that, and how much damage is that going to do in all the seats that we've won? And we've got to hold on to seats like mine if we're going to have a majority next time. So I think the political reality is it's time to act as well as all the reasons of the fairness. Thank you, Phoebe.
Thank you very much, Erin. If I could go to Lord Willetts for his 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And look, I thought that was a really powerful opening presentation from Aaron. As a real MP facing real electors, I've retreated to the safety of the House of Lords. That gives me a perspective, but it was fantastic to have that powerfully put on behalf of the Red Wall seats. Look, my starting point, I think it's really important that all of us as Conservatives make it clear. First of all, we don't like taxes. We prefer to have lower taxes. But given there are always going to be some taxes, and we have to fund our welfare state and other things, the taxes we do have should be well designed and effective. So it's legitimate for Conservatives to debate tax. One of the problems, I think, sometimes people think, as we've all got to be against tax, we couldn't possibly engage with any constructive thinking about how we should tax, but we should. And secondly, we're not against wealth. We don't hate rich people, and we're not against wealth. We're simply trying to have a well-designed system. And I think one of the biggest changes in Britain in the last 30 years has been the increase in the value of wealth relative to incomes. The total wealth we had, our houses and our pensions, used to be 3 times our national income. They've now reached 7 times our national income. And that means that trying to use your earnings to buy something has got harder. It means, interestingly, that inheritance has got far more important. But it also means that if you are looking around for taxes that you need to raise, it is striking how the proportion of GDP taken in taxes on property in the broadest sense has not gone up at all. And in fact, our main tax on capital is council tax. We're quite lucky, actually. It even counts as a tax on capital, because as we know, many renters pay it. But anyway, OECD passes it as a property or asset tax, and it's the biggest one we've got. And it's not at all well designed, and we're going to hear from the real experts like Andrew later on, but it's got massive defects. It is very regressive because, as you heard, low-value properties pay a much higher proportion than high-value properties. It's paid by renters. And you've just put those two things together, you've got a tax that is particularly tough on younger people, exactly the people we need to get into our party. So I think that's the drawbacks of council tax. And for stamp duty, it's a tax on transactions. And it's one of the reasons why the property market is getting gummed up. There are fewer people who are willing to sell their property, especially older people who could be trading down. Now, as this is now history, I'm going to report a conversation I had with George Osborne when he was Chancellor, when I was raising some of these issues with him, discussing them. And it was quite, and it was typical George at his most ingenious. He said, look, well, the way I see it, he said, yes, we do need some kind of tax on property. But he said, have you noticed that on average, a property transaction happens every 7 years? And have you noticed that the average of all the different stamp duty rates I've now introduced is 7%? It's basically a 1% a year property tax, but badged in a different way and on transactions. I think it's a pity that it's on transactions. I think it's better if we could unblock the transactions and introduce this tax, which would be, it's estimated in order roughly to raise what's raised at the moment, about 0.5% of the value of a property every year. Couple of final points on it. Of course, there's the obvious anxiety of people who are asset rich and cash poor, and that's always an issue. But it should be possible to have some mechanism whereby if your income is below a certain amount, it is a charge on the estate. There is some deferred payment mechanism, not unlike the mechanism which the government itself is introducing as part of its social care package, where again there is supposed to be a mechanism for deferred payment. In turn, you then need to make it easier for local authorities or others to borrow against this future tax revenue they're going to receive. But we have to tackle that, and that's included in the design. But to end, I just very much agree with Aaron's key point. Property owning democracy is one of the great Tory slogans. And when I was working for Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, we had council house sales and we had Telsyd campaigns, and ownership of property and ownership of shares spread. And we started moving to, and we promoted private pensions as well. I think one of the long-term challenges facing our party is the retreat of property ownership, so that younger people are less likely to own a property, people are less likely to hold shares. This is very dangerous for the long-term future of conservatism. We've got to help young people get started on the housing ladder, and this tax would bring more houses onto the market and would mean that people in low-value houses were not paying so much tax.
Thank you. Anya, can we come to you?
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Anya Martin, I'm the Director of PricedOut. If you don't know us, we are a campaign for affordable housing in England and a campaign for first-time buyers specifically, which may be a dying breed. We fight for everyone who is priced out of the home that they need in the area they want to live. So I want to talk a bit about property and housing, and to set that kind of context, we have a housing crisis, and it is a crisis of affordability specifically. So real house prices in England have gone up by 400% since 1970, and that compares to an OECD average of 100%, so it's rising much faster here than in other comparable countries. Rents, which are an even better measure of the cost of housing, have also risen very rapidly. So I had a look the other day. In 1995, a 4-bed house in Southwark went for £1,800 a month in today's prices. Now, the cheapest one that I could find on Rightmove the other day was £2,500, and the average was £2,800. So that difference over the course of 25 years is almost an entire full-time wage on minimum wage. So it's actually becoming impossible in some areas of the country to raise a family, and that area is spreading as well. And this kind of affordability challenge feeds into many other crises that we're facing as well. So homelessness, declining home ownership, especially amongst the young, inability to save for the future, which is just storing up problems for pensions in the future, forced sharing, sometimes even into the 30s and sometimes even the 40s in some areas of the country. We have a lack of competition in the housing market, which is leading to poor conditions and poor management that landlords can get away with because people are so desperate. Now, PricedOut mainly focuses on the housing supply aspect of this problem, that we need to build more homes, and until we do build more homes, this problem is just going to get worse. But there are things that you can do in the interim period to improve it, and I think we can do quite a lot through taxation reform. Our tax system I would describe as totally backwards. Stamp duty is a tax and therefore something that discourages and disincentivises housing transactions, as the others have already mentioned, which is a really not a helpful way to approach it. Essentially, you kind of punish people moving house, whether they want more space for their family or whether they want to downsize or to move to the seaside in their retirement or whatever. And it kind of contrasts us with other countries like the USA, Australia and New Zealand, where retirees will often move to retirement villages, pleasant areas to spend your retirement, access to amenities as your mobility declines and so on. Instead, we trap our elderly in large homes that are sometimes across several stories. They can struggle with the upkeep of these homes, and there's a much higher risk of falls. So it's a pretty bad tax to discourage people from moving around when they want to and when they need to. And council tax is equally as bad. It's unfair. You can tax properties worth millions of pounds at a higher rate even than small family homes in Sunderland or whatever. These two taxes jointly make moving very expensive and staying very cheap, even if you're occupying more space than you actually need or even want in very high demand areas. So it's bad for people who want to move, it's bad for the distribution of homes, it's bad for under-occupation and overcrowding, and it's bad for the supply of homes as well, because it incentivises people to have second homes or even leave homes empty when actually you could incentivise them to do otherwise. Which is why we support Fairer Share, and thank you to Fairer Share for putting these proposals together, saves us the effort. You need to abolish stamp duty, you need to reform council tax. Why not do it? Replace them with this proportional property tax. There are several reasons that we at PricedOut really like this idea. First of all is that if you put the cost onto the landlord as well, that means renters' costs will decline quite substantially, and as we know, the private rented sector is extremely expensive. People renting from private landlords spend the highest proportion of their income on their housing, so they are the people that have really a lot to gain from doing this. It means that especially people's incomes in poorer areas of the country will increase, so it's very good for the levelling up priorities. It means they have more to spend in their local economies as well. It will bring more housing onto the market, so second homes and empty homes, supporting home ownership ambitions as well as lowering the cost of housing. And it will mean that people aren't disincentivised from moving around. And additionally, as a final thing, it would also be priced into the value of housing as well. And that, for first-time buyers, is especially important because it's actually often the deposit barrier that prevents people from getting, not the actual monthly costs of the mortgage. So it's a really fantastic policy that hits off quite a lot of important areas of people's lives. So again, thank you to Fairer Share for bringing it forward, and thank you to Bright Blue for having me here.
Thank you, Anya. Carol, your 5 minutes, please.
Okay. Going forward is always going to be difficult. There's three experts on before me, and I'm not going to disagree with them. They've all made very good points. Proportional property tax of 0.48% as being proposed, where does the research on your desk, on your seats shows, would mean 75% of households being better off. 6.5 billion per year being saved by council taxpayers outside London, up to 600,000 homes released into the market over the course of the next 5 years, and a 3.27 billion per year increase in GDP from an increased housing market. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pick holes in the economists' calculations. I'm not qualified to do that. But what I thought I would do is look at some of the objections and some of the questions as a way of stirring up a bit of debate, because it would be jolly boring if we all just sat here and agreed with each other. So firstly, the proposals state that the landlord, not the tenant, will pay, and I am super sceptical of this. I've yet to come across a landlord who's presented with higher running costs who does not, in one form or another, pass that on to the tenant. So I think tenants will pay. I also worry that it could be used as an excuse, particularly maybe by landlords, for not improving properties. And to this end, a land value tax might be a better proposition to consider. I also worry, as mentioned, we've heard concerns from the equity rich and income poor homeowners, and they could pay up to 1,200 more a year. And I'm very pleased that that cap has been put on it. And I understand it can be deferred until they sell or they die. But even 1,200 more a year for 10, 20 years at a modest rate of interest does add up. And I put out a call on Twitter, a few of you might have seen yesterday, asking for people to lay into this and give me some ideas. and there was a pensioner who came forward and said that if the triple lock was under threat, then she worried that her pension wouldn't keep pace with the tax increase. I appreciate, as Anya said, that a change could encourage some people to downsize, which would be a good thing. But for that to be a realistic proposition, I think we really need to address the dearth of suitable homes for people to downsize to. I know this from personal experience of trying to help my 82-year-old mother move from our family home, which is by no means palatial. It's a 3-bedroom semi in Cambridgeshire. But it's not as easy as it should be. Retirement homes are poor quality, expensive, with extremely high fees and charges. In her case, it's the lack of somewhere suitable to move to rather than a stamp duty that's keeping her in the family home. And where she lives, 1 and 2 bedroom bungalows are as rare as hen's teeth and cost actually more than 3-bedroom houses. I worry that the 0.48% would start to creep up as the government puts pressure on councils to fund more and more, for instance, social care, which could see council tax rise by 2.6 billion or 9% in the next year, according to the media reports yesterday. I worry that councils in areas where property prices are lower are going to need to increase their element of their tax charge more than those in areas where property is expensive. I also don't believe that it's a panacea for unaffordable housing in London and the South East. I don't think it'll miraculously make it cheaper in London and the South East than it is. I think it shifts the costs around slightly, but I don't think we're going to suddenly see property prices crash. Ultimately, despite having said all that, I am in favour of it because I think it's a lot fairer than what we've got, but I don't think it's straightforward. I think there are a few issues that are worth debating.
Thank you, Carol. Andrew?
Great, thanks so much, Phoebe. Hi everyone, my name's Andrew Dixon. I'm former Goldman Sachs venture capitalist and founder of Fair Share. Thank you, Bright Blue, for hosting today's event, and also thank you for your great paper, Home Truths. I think if you have a bit of time later and you want some bedtime reading, I would definitely recommend the excellent paper, Home Truths, that also does advocate a proportional property tax. Just a quick background, because we haven't really gone into the detail of the reform. We've touched upon it, but just as a quick summary, we removed stamp duty, we removed council tax, and we replaced both with a proportional property tax of 0.48%. It's a simple flat rate, so it's not even progressive, and it's not progressive because of the fact that we have the cap of 1,200 at the point of transition. We see it as pro-aspiration. I think Carol's highlighted many of the benefits. 76% of households would see a lower council tax bill, £3 billion boost to the economy, and very importantly for the levelling up agenda, as Carol said, the 6.5 billion tax reduction in the regions. The housing market, I think we've touched upon obviously the problems that stamp duty impose. WPI Economics has done a great report, I think it might have been on your chairs, highlighting that around 600,000 houses would be freed up for the market in terms of reduced costs. My parents, they're in their 80s, they refuse to downsize, not because necessarily of a lack of choice, though I agree there is a lack of choice, but primarily because if they did downsize, they would have to pay probably 18 months worth of living expenses in stamp duty. So what's the point? And I think as Lord Willetts has highlighted, this is incredibly detrimental to younger generations. First-time buyers discount is helpful, but it's not enough. You know, people want to be able to move up and down the ladder at different points in their lives. You know, I had an email from one of our supporters yesterday saying that she's just divorced. She's now got to find a smaller house, and she's still got to pay a huge amount in stamp duty. And obviously Cornwall, I mean, one looks at Cornwall, and I don't know if you've seen the stats on the ability to rent in Cornwall, let alone buy. But it's particularly challenging given, obviously, the enthusiasm of certain parts of the country to buy second homes down by the beach. So, you know, lots of benefits in us removing stamp duty. I'd like to touch upon Aaron's point around the levelling up agenda, and I think it's really helpful that Michael Gove and Neil O'Brien have highlighted, I think, 4 key priorities for them. Local leadership, raising living standards, improving public services, and developing local pride. And I think that's all fantastic. I would like to understand how that's going to be measured and what the concrete policies are to actually be able to deliver on some of those objectives. And I think Jake Berry was spot on when he asked for greater clarity as to what this means. How do we measure success? In many ways, the elephant in the room, in my opinion, is local government finance. And I think if we are going to reform property taxes, local government finance and how that sits has got to be right at the centre. You know, we don't fund the NHS through council tax, and I find it a little bit absurd that we try and fund adult social care through council tax as well. And you know, a lot of people say, oh, it's all about the bins. You know, I don't really want to pay more council tax. It's about the bins. The bins got nothing to do with it. Council tax is all about funding the police. It's about education. It's about housing. So I think we've got to be very clear on what the sort of issues we want to address. And my real strong recommendation to Michael Gove and Neil O'Brien is they include local government finance in their thinking. We've talked about regions. We've talked about younger generations, as Lord Willetts highlighted. One small thing I'd just like to highlight, because I think this chimes very much with what Michael Gove is saying around local government, is as part of our 0.48%, we think part of it should be national and fixed and use the redistributive element around the country, but another part of it should be floating and local, so it can go up and down, you know, respecting the local referenda principles. So very much looking forward to trying to work with Michael Gove and Neil O'Brien. I understand they've got a Levelling Up white paper coming out in October, which I think maybe October, maybe November. But I think it should make some interesting reading. I'm really hoping local government finance and housing will be part of it. We've talked about some of the barriers. Obviously, we have the cap of £100 a month. We think this is palatable. Our research shows that if you're living in a house worth less than £500,000, you will see a reduction. If you're living in a larger house, then you may see an increase. But again, that's capped at £100, and we have a deferral to make sure we can look after pensioners who happen to be asset-rich, cash-poor. I do not believe there are that many in this country who are asset-rich, cash-poor and cannot afford £100 a month, I have to be honest. I know if you run a big house, it costs money. Valuation has been highlighted as a possible issue. To be honest, I think, you know, the UK prides itself on its data analytics. Valuation is not the problem to why we cannot have a proportional property tax. You know, all of you, I'm sure within 5 minutes of leaving this room, could look at Zoopla or Rightmove and get a pretty good stab at what your value is at. So to me, the issues are all political, and I think this very much sits with what Aaron was saying right at the beginning. It's clearly council taxes is a very unpopular tax, we know that. It's going to be interesting at the next general election, you know, when MPs for Hartlepool, Bishop Auckland, Blythe Valley, etc. have to campaign. I think they have to deliver for the voters. So we're really grateful for the cross-party support. Bright Blue, IPPR, Onward, lots of leading think tanks, peers, campaigners, charities, the media. We've had a very sort of supportive engagement with the media, which has always been really very important for us in terms of the Times, the Mail, the Telegraph, etc. So super excited. There's lots of things that we can do. Really appreciate you giving up your time to join us today. Look forward to our discussion. Happy to answer any questions. Please do follow us on Fair Share. Very happy to get involved. I have some answers for Carol's very, very good questions, but maybe we can cover that in Q&A.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. So I'll go to Erin first with a question that perhaps Andrew would like to come in on afterwards. So to listen to this panel, I mean, proportional property tax is almost universally welcomed. I mean, even Carol, who was trying her best to challenge us and challenge you all, you know, I mean, even she supports it. So who's the real opposition to this idea? What's actually standing in the way? Is it apathy? Is it something else?
So, yeah, I mean, that's a common theme at some of the panels I've been at this conference, that you end up with a lot of people who all think this is a good idea. And I mean, Carol made a lot of the points that I hear from colleagues. Obviously, you know, colleagues have written against this already in the press. I think one of my colleagues, a good friend of mine, Anthony Brown, South Cambridgeshire, very different seat to Newcastle under Lyme, wrote in The Spectator, putting the other side, basically. And I completely get that, and I get the fear amongst colleagues in the South who've got, you know, high property values in their seats, who will not, you know, overall their seat will not be a net gainer. And the 76%, you know, that's nearly 95% in my constituency. It's nearly 100% bluntly in Hartlepool and Blythe Valley. You know, it puts a lot of money back in the pockets of my constituents, and that money has to come from somewhere. An awful lot of it comes from central London because property values are so high there. There'll obviously be a lot of opposition there. Point about landlords that was made. I mean, I'm not under any illusions that some of it won't be passed on in rent, and that's perfectly normal with any tax. There's tax incidents that it will be passed on. I do think there's some additional benefits there as well. I've, you know, seen people who are social renting or private renting, and they can keep up with the rent, but they don't manage to keep up with the council tax, and they end up being taken through the courts by local authorities who take too long to realise that they're behind on the council tax, and that's just a waste of everybody's time, and ultimately gets them the court judgment against them and everything else. So, but to answer your question more generally, yes, there is an issue with the losers. You know, any this is revenue neutral, by the way. For any revenue neutral system is going to create winners and losers. That's the same reason that no government's had the courage to go back to do revaluations on council tax, because you create winners and losers. You know, I mean, an even simpler thing would be just to create Band I, Band J on council tax. But again, no government has wanted to do that because winners and losers. And, you know, in any case, the losers tend to make more noise than the winners. But what we've got here is a load of MPs who can make a lot of noise on behalf of the winners, because we've suddenly got a lot of MPs who will be representing constituencies where 99% of people are winners, and that will put more money in their pockets and more money into our local economies.
Thank you, Erin. Andrew, can I get you on that? I mean, you speak to a lot of people about this idea. I mean, where do you find the fiercest opposition?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It is the southeast, but I do feel that it is right for reform local government finance in general, council tax in particular, and stamp duty in general. I think all of this needs reform, and I think we need to be brave. I think people in this country, with all due respect, don't mind paying taxes as long as it's fair and it's understandable and it's manageable and it's affordable. And I think the increase that we have in council tax liabilities is unhelpful, and I think it's nothing that this country should be proud of. So I think we don't mind paying taxes as long as they're fair and they're flat. We're not even asking for a progressive reform.
Well, Willetts, you wrote yesterday in the Times about proportional property tax. You said politicians cannot afford to ignore these kinds of policies if the generation gap is not to widen further in the years ahead. I mean, do you think that, are you hopeful that the current government is listening? Do you think they are willing to risk the southeast heartlands?
I think, who am I to predict? By the way, I think the other problem is that council tax goes back to one of the biggest traumas in the history of the post-war Conservative Party. And there are a lot of people, I started off in the politics in the 1980s. There are a lot of people who remember about 5 years when, first of all, the Scottish rates completely destroyed the party in Scotland. Then we had the poll tax, and then John Major and Hezza kind of solved the problem with council tax. And it was a dominant issue in Conservative politics. And there are people around. You can watch their faces turn pale when you talk about council tax. So the trouble is there's a kind of almost irrational fear now of doing anything about this because it was all so painful in the 1980s. That's the actual reason, I think. And there are still people sitting in government for whom they regard it as, that classic American expression, the sort of third rail. But I don't think that is, I think that is now emotion, not reason. I don't think it makes sense anymore. And partly for the reasons we've heard about the change in the Tory base, that's a very important factor. And also when you say how the Treasury thinking, sadly, and I don't say this with any relish, sadly when you look at, we did some work at Resolution which just took current policy on the welfare state, things like health and pensions, and you can see, sadly, as there are going to be more and more old people as boomers grow old, there is going to be upward pressure on public spending. And my reading from the conversations that we have with Treasury, and look, this is not Treasury ministers even, it's just, if you are looking around thinking Britain needs a better designed tax system, you can see that we are very unusual in taxing earnings so heavily relative to assets. And I think that the toe in the water with an insurance social care levy was interesting, because I think at one point it was just going to be conventional national insurance. And people were quite taken aback when we said, hang on, that means it is literally a tax where no person of pension age, you are exempt just by virtue of being a pensioner. This is ludicrous. And so they did extend it to pensioners and also to income from dividends. So I think there are quite a few people in the Treasury who would like to just get some rather better capital taxes than we have now. So I think it is an issue that can be approached, provided we realise there are people out there with post-traumatic stress syndrome who will need massive calming down through the process.
Thank you, Lord Willetts. If I could go to Anya, I mean, Carol expressed scepticism about your assurances that it's not renters, it's not tenants who end up paying. I mean, if you're honest, are you also quite worried that that could happen if this reform is introduced?
No, and I say that because, not that I don't agree with Carol that there is a risk that some of it will be passed on, but as it is at the moment, in general, the tenants and renters will pay all of it. So even if landlords pass on part of those costs, it's still a reduction. And we had a very similar situation a few years ago when we introduced the Tenant Fees Ban. And there were a lot of concerns that those fees would just be passed directly on into higher rents, and they weren't in practice because, firstly, only half of landlords were using letting agents in the first place, so it wasn't that they could fully pass on the costs, because then otherwise they would be uncompetitive with the rest of the market. So I do think, although it's possible that part of it is passed on, it will either way it will be a benefit to renters. And quite frankly, when you are paying, £800 a month to rent a bedroom, that difference, it really does mean quite a lot in terms of your monthly income and how much you have to spend.
Thank you, Anya. Could I ask you to come back in on that, Carol?
I think we have to be careful about squeezing private landlords. We've seen recently a lot of measures brought in that have squeezed them. It's not that I've got particular love of private landlords. I'm not one.
I am.
But we do need them, and until we have alternatives in place, I don't want to see landlords absolutely squeezed to death out of the system. We do need rental properties. There's no way around it. They need to be in the mix. We need all tenures in the mix. So I would like to be careful on that. On the point before, I don't think the fact that we're scared and emotional and can remember the council tax, the poll tax riots means it's a reason for not doing it. I think 30 years without addressing it, it's time to do it. And now is the time. We can't wait another 20, 30 years. And we've seen from the stamp duty cut that actually it's not the only reason lots of people have moved. There are lots of reasons why people have moved, not least cheap money at the moment. But now is the right time to start addressing it.
Thank you, Carol. Just before we open it up to the floor and start bringing some audience questions in as well, Andrew, Carol mentioned that a land value tax would be an alternative to proportional property tax. Why wouldn't that be a superior reform?
Yeah, I'm so pleased you asked me that question, Phoebe, and thank you, Carol, for the... Thank you. I happen to be a Henry Georgist. I love LVT. I think it's an ideal solution. It's a pure tax. I think it would be super for the economy. Particularly as an investor in young entrepreneurs, it would be wonderful if people were investing their spare capital into businesses and not into properties. We started off with an LVT solution. We could not make it work, and the reason for that is because land values in London and the South East were so high. All of the tax take would be from the South East and London. Very little of it would be from other parts of the country, and I think that would have been a step too far. In terms of trying to bring about this sort of reform. I do think this could well be a pathway towards LVT, which would be ideal, and I think all economists would think wonderful news. But I think that we're on a journey. Henry George hasn't got anywhere for 100 years, so we have to be patient here. Carol, do I see PPT as being a deterrent to improvements? I don't actually, partly because we've already got VAT at 20%. So I think with a PPT at 0.48%, I don't see it necessarily being a deterrent. But yeah, thank you so much for asking that question.
Fantastic. So let's go to the floor. So I just ask that you be patient and wait till a microphone is with you before you begin speaking, just for the sake of the live stream. We can go to this gentleman here first, please. Just wait to...
Thank you. Andrew, you mentioned Cornwall. Cornwall doesn't particularly bother me that much. What really annoys me more than anything else is people using offshore companies to buy property in London. If it was released, would probably cut the property values of London by 10%. There is a massive amount of empty properties. If you go to Vauxhall, there's a tower block there that's empty all the time. It's totally owned by people in Asia who never come there. That is wrong. And can I just say that some very rich people, Tony and Cherie Blair, have just evaded £380,000 property tax. So doing away with a property tax on the point of exchange and putting it onto the value of the property, I think is a sensible idea. It's outrageous that people can evade taxes and not pay their fair share. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Let's just answer this question first, and then we'll take some more. If I can ask you to come in on that.
Yeah, thank you. Really good point. One thing I didn't mention is we actually have maintaining stamp duty for foreign buyers and for second homeowners. So stamp duty remains for that. So those who see property as a pure investment, we continue to keep stamp duty. And the other element, we have a surcharge on those who are fortunate enough to own a second home and those who are foreign homeowners. So it's a 0.96% rate for those who are fortunate to be in that position. And one thing is for sure is you can't put it through a business. It's a residential property. We should know who owns it, and that a tax should be paid on that, because I think, you know, for my staff and my businesses throughout London, housing affordability is a real problem. So you're spot on. I completely agree.
Can I just ask Andrew, would that mean that the business tax relief loophole would be closed?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that would make a big difference.
Yeah, I think this ties in actually, I completely agree with your point, and it ties in with COVID and its impact on cities and city centres. Because I think your effect, I mean, I cycle around in central London, and I cycle sometimes past those two big candy tower blocks in Knightsbridge. And kind of, I think if I was cycling past and you could see the chandeliers on and the tinkling sound of the champagne being drunk in nice parties that sadly one wasn't invited to, but at least things were happening, that would be so much better. Every time I cycle past, it's completely black, apart from the security guards sitting on the ground floor protecting the property. And kind of London was a bustly place, but London, if we're going to have an environment where there are going to be these dead areas, when we are more desperate to bring life into our city centres, I think it makes, a topical argument is that the phenomenon you describe is more damaging now with the shift in patterns of life post-COVID.
Thank you for your questions. So before we go back to our physical audience, we'll just take a question from the virtual audience. So we have a question from Samuel, which I think I'll ask Erin to come in on first, followed by Andrew, who asks, could we legislatively entrench the property tax rate amount and ensure it does not keep creeping up? Thank you for your question, Samuel. Would you like to take that, Erin?
I'm not a big fan of putting legislative handcuffs on governments. It's something that's crept into government over the last 10, 15 years. It's caused us trouble already in this Parliament with the overseas aid budget target. It's caused me problems in my constituency with commitments on air quality, which we know are going to be fixed in 3 years' time because of electric vehicles coming in. But in the meantime, we're going to, if DEFRA don't do something and basically close one of my roads, it's going to cause problems. And I don't really agree with putting targets into legislation. Governments are there to govern. Government ministers are there to make decisions about these things at the time, weighing up all the things in the balance, as Rishi did over, for example, the overseas aid target. So I understand the sentiment that Samuel's got, that he doesn't want it to creep up and up. But somebody else made the point earlier that with the bulge, the baby boomers becoming the retirees, getting into social care, we all want lower taxes, but we have to be realistic about the demographics we're facing, and putting handcuffs on ourselves that will later have to break is just storing up trouble for the future, in my opinion.
Thank you, Erin. Andrew?
Nothing really to add other than the fact when we were designing our tax reform, we didn't think it was in our gift to have a tax increase or a tax reduction, which is why we wanted to make it revenue neutral overall. And I think that's a question for the parliamentarians, not for someone like me.
Okay, thank you. Right, can we go to this lady here?
Hi, so I'd be interested to hear the panel's views on Nimbyism. So obviously in Amersham we had an issue where the Liberal Democrats were pretty much putting forward that the reason why people should vote for them is because they weren't going to build affordable housing nearby, and so the value of people's property wouldn't necessarily drop by having lots of new affordable housing. Now, I'm a young person who lives very close in Vauxhall. I live in the MC Gardens complex. I pay over £2,000 in rent just to live in southwest London. And it's shocking that now they want to raise the rent to 50% more just because they've opened Battersea Power Station, Tube Station. So what can we do for young people like me who would like to be a homeowner, who would like to live in London, when we can't build affordable housing because everybody else is saying, no, I don't want it in my back garden?
Thank you very much for your question. If we can go to Anya first on that, maybe followed by Lord Willetts.
Yeah, so, I mean, it probably won't surprise you to know that I think, despite the fact that most people in this country haven't heard of Nimbyism, I think it is the defining political problem of our times. Until we sort out this issue that our planning system is very much designed around giving people who essentially by definition already have a home and can afford to live in the area a veto over newcomers, we are going to continue to see worsening housing affordability, and obviously there are great things you can do like proportional property taxation to help alleviate that, but over the long run this is an issue we have to solve. I mean, perhaps I'm a bit bullish by nature, but I think actually governments could simply stand up to a lot of this. Actually, I think the extent to which it is an electoral problem is probably is inflated by the fact that as a councillor, as a politician, if you're getting quite a lot of angry people coming in and shouting at you, you will be inclined to think that's quite a major issue in the area, when actually what we know is that the people who do oppose new developments and new affordable housing developments near them are actually a very, very small minority of the population, and they have certain characteristics. They're almost entirely homeowners, they're mostly retired, and so on. So I think it does occupy a larger space in politicians' minds than it necessarily has to. But of course, there are loads of things you can do to alleviate that. Things like the street votes proposal that Policy Exchange published recently are designed to bring those people on board and to encourage them to want to bring forward their own land to build more homes. I'll stop talking there because that was quite long. Got enthusiastic, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Not enough. This is, when I was an MP, this was the problem that got me writing the pinch, because you do a constituency surgery and some guy who was working at Tesco's would turn up with his girlfriend who was a nurse, and they would say, we are still living in my parents' spare room with the baby in a cardboard cot at the bottom of the bed because we cannot find anywhere we can afford to live. And then you'd go to the Residents' Association meeting, decent people who had lived in an area for ages, and they're all sort of governors of the local school, and they're gathered to protest against any housing development. And you, as a politician, and Aaron must be doing, you're not a kamikaze pilot. You don't want to, you want to win votes, you want to lose. And I found that the best argument to use with the people in the Residents' Association was to say, look, I know where you live. I know those are nice little houses built in the 1970s. The previous generation to you realised that you needed a place to live, and they built that estate for you. Don't you think you have a similar obligation to do for the younger generation what the previous generation did for you, so that you've got the houses you've got? Now, there's no single compelling argument. So this is not for migrants. This is just because there are babies being born round here, and there are young families round here trying to do the right thing who haven't got anywhere to live. And I found that does at least set people thinking. And the polling evidence is that if you ask people the crucial question, do you think more houses need to be built in your area? Which is, it's in your area makes it real, isn't it? You're right. That support for that has gone from about 25% to just over 50%. So I do think we're beginning to win that argument.
To just add to that, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think this policy is profoundly liberal and democratic, so I look forward to Lib Dems campaigning against it, because it's exactly what happened in Cheshire and Amersham, and if you can't build new houses near the end of 2 tube lines, I'm not quite sure where the sensible place to build houses is. But to speak to what Anya said, what's going on, and I understand people lobbying for their own personal interests. I mean, it is literally rent seeking, isn't it? But what we can do with this policy is actually take some of the pressure off planning, because it is a pressure for all of us as local politicians as well. We can release more property onto the market for the reasons we discussed. And in the reality, people don't live in houses. People live in bedrooms, and we can release bedrooms onto the market, because the bedroom allocation in this country is all wrong. There are plenty of rooms around, but a lot of them are empty because they're being occupied by the sort of overseas buyers that this man over here spoke about, but also empty because they're being occupied by people who've got no incentive to move to something more suitable for themselves. So I think we can square the circle a little bit with that aspect of this as well.
Thank you, Aaron. Andrew, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, just a quick one. You might remember I talked about the floating rate and the national fixed rate. As part of the floating rate, my belief is that local authorities, if they want to grant more land for properties in their local community, they should retain that value. And at the moment, that's not happening, partly because a huge amount of our property taxes is stamp duty, which does not go to the local authority. So if you have a proportional property tax, you could have a portion of it, you grant planning permission, you keep the revenue for that forever.
Thank you, Andrew. Right, let's have some more questions. If we have this gentleman here at the front, followed by the gentleman right next to him.
Thank you. I think part of the problem we've got at the moment is we're spending a lot of time in the Conservative Party worrying about what is good for London and the South East, and we're ignoring what's good for the Midlands and the North. Our new Conservative voters, as someone from the North, and has been fighting this for years. And we're looking at, and I think Carol mentioned it before, we're not building, you go and build a new estate now, they will all be the same, little shoebox, 3-bedroom, you can't swing a cat in it, houses. There are no bungalows for older people to move into. In the North, stamp duty isn't a big issue. to be quite frankly. For most people, it's not an issue. There's nowhere for them to go and move into. So they're stuck in those big 3-bedroom, quite roomy 60s, 70s, 3-bedroom, semi-detached houses, not releasing them for families to move into, because there's nowhere for them to move into, because there isn't those bungalows, those retirement villages that you find in America, where you'll have those retirement areas, which are mixed. They're not just all old people there, but there will be some newer people there. So you can fiddle around with taxes and everything else, but you're not resolving the issue until we start getting the developers out there to actually build the houses that we need, not what the developers can make most money on.
Fantastic, thank you. So if you just keep hold of the microphone for now, and just, if I can get perhaps Anya followed by Erin would like to come in on that question.
Yeah, well, that's quite right. We do, I mean, again, everything comes back to the planning system when you're speaking to me. We don't build enough of any types of homes. We don't build enough small homes as well. And this is something that I get a lot of criticism for, actually. When I go and say to local authorities, I think we should build 1-bed, 2-bed flats, they say, no, we need family homes because families are struggling. Obviously, if you build smaller homes, then that frees up family homes as well. So the idea that local authorities are kind of saying, no, this is the type of home we need, not this type, and then you generate gluts of certain types of homes. They don't sell very fast, so the developer doesn't want to build them very fast, and so on. You just create this absolute circular mess of just not creating the types of homes people want where they want. So we do have to address that through the planning system, and local authorities need to recognise that any functioning system provides a range of types of housing, and we do have specifically, I would say, a shortage of smaller 1- and 2-bedroom places for young people, but also for older people who want to downsize.
Thank you. So Erin, this is that sort of thing that worries the Northern Research Group, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think Anya's absolutely right about what people are incentivised to build. I do think it was MHCLG at the time was doing some good stuff about trying to work out how we can build more beautiful homes, because you don't want these identikit. Well, I mean, a lot of people do like these identikit estates, but I think that that's part of why people are against housing being built in their area. They don't want a little toy town built around them. Richard Bacon, actually, a colleague of mine, has just put a paper out there. I can't remember the exact title of it, but it's about self-build and what we can do about that, and encourage people to build the houses they want that suit them. And obviously, if you take out the transactional costs of doing that through removing stamp duty, that will help as well. But yeah, I mean, it comes back to the same point I meant before. People live in bedrooms, so if you give them the houses that have the number of bedrooms that they actually require, then they can free up the houses that have the number of bedrooms that the families require. Exactly the point Anya just made.
Thank you. Can we have your question, please?
Hi, there's so much material I could engage with all of you. It's just wonderful. I'll try to pick 2 points if it's okay. And first of all, I must declare an interest. I am a landlord. I know I'm one of the sort of sinners around here, so it seems like just me and one colleague over there. So you're all free to hate me, and that's fine. The 2 points, really. The first one, you've all approached stamp duty as being a tax on the purchaser. But there is a train of thought that the stamp duty is, in fact, a tax on the vendor, because if I'm in the process of purchasing a house, say for £200,000 in the northwest, or £1 million or something down the southeast, I've got a finite budget, and that budget really should include any stamp duty costs as well. So that means I'll be paying less to the vendor because I've got to keep some money back for the stamp duty. So the way it sort of feels, of course, as a purchaser is that when you receive your completion statement, it says stamp duty 3%, whatever. Oh God, that's an awful lot of money to pay. And I appreciate the impact on the mobility, but from the vendor's perspective, they could have been receiving that stamp duty. So you guys are running a risk that when you scrap stamp duty, all that you will actually achieve is to sort of bump up the house prices by a little bit, by that sort of 3 or 4 or 5%. So you just got to be careful about that, okay? So sort of an unintended consequence of that. Secondly, all of the legislation going through at the moment, sort of a higher capital gains tax for landlords, the stamp duty on landlords, all gums up the sort of the business for a landlord anyway. I cannot afford to sell a property, sort of release it to sort of a tenant or something, because I would incur, terrific costs of selling that property on. So if I buy a property, I'm going to hold on to it forever, until I sort of die and pass it on, because I'd be nuts to do anything else. It's just crazy. And that's it, really. Sorry for my little rant, but you know what I mean.
Thank you. Carol, can I ask you to come in first?
Yes, I mean, we have seen some of what you've said, actually. With the stamp duty cut, we have seen property prices go up because sellers have thought, well, you've got more money to spend, so have really pushed it to get that up. So I can see your point on that. I think maybe, though, you would think about the costs rather than just pass them on. You'd build that into the equation, maybe, that would stop you doing quite the extreme that you're saying. As I said earlier, I do think that we should use this tax, and I don't see how it would be used to squeeze out landlords. I wouldn't want to see that. I think we do need to keep a mixture of tenures, definitely.
And Andrew?
Yeah, great question. Just as a quick one, our research indicated that landlords would be able to pass on about 66% of the PPT to their tenants, roughly. I mean, that's going to obviously change by regions and sort of nature of the tenant, but that's our estimate. Our belief is that tax on property should be over the lifetime of ownership, not at the beginning, at the end. I think stamp duty, whether you define it as a tax at the beginning or the end, I think is not the point. I think over the lifetime is a far superior way of doing it. My last point was in terms of prices. Our estimates are we would see a fall in London prices of about 5%, and we would see an increase in house prices of about 5% in the regions, roughly, with this sort of reform, which actually I think may not be a bad thing, given greater wealth values could be created in the regions, which again I think sort of chimes with the levelling up agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. If we could go to this lady here.
Thank you, cohort landlord. And I would say, I think this concept is very good. I am originally from Canada, and that is how tax is. So you're nodding, you've done some research. The issue I want to raise is you've suggested that a property tax for second homeowners would be the same as foreign homeowners. And is there a particular reason why you would not tax foreign owners significantly more, particularly in the London area? You can see that is why property prices have skyrocketed. It would seem to me that somebody who lives in this country would be in a different position, even if it's a second home, rather than foreign investment.
Thank you for your question. Andrew?
Yeah, Canada, fantastic. I mean, I think, you know, in many ways, they don't stop at 0.48%, right? They stop at 1 or 2% in some cases of property values. So, yeah, Canada's definitely been an inspiration for our work. Just to be clear, buy-to-lets would not have the surcharge. So this is purely for second homes, empty homes, and foreign homes. So buy-to-lets if you're a landlord. And the reason for this is we didn't want that surcharge being passed on to the tenant. So I just wanted to be crystal clear that for buy-to-lets, it's not a case of the surcharge. Does that help?
My real question is about foreign investment.
Yeah, I guess that's going to be a discussion with Treasury, I suspect, if we're ever lucky to have that conversation. But I'm sure there's lots of nuances that could be tweaked upwards or downwards.
The Treasury Minister did actually just accidentally walk into the room.
I know.
He looked very worried and left.
There goes my promotion. You know.
Could we have some more audience questions, please? Can we go to this gentleman who's standing?
Hi, Andrew White from Barclay Group, one of the much maligned property developers. Just to announce an interest, I think we might have actually built the building that the gentleman down the front was referring to earlier on. Yeah. It's worth, I think, reflecting that a lot of the property taxes that we have at the moment are levied at the point at which you actually create value. So you don't have them levied when you own it, but if you build a new property development, you create a lot of value from nothing, and the first thing that happens is you pay an absolute plethora of taxes, a lot of which go up, even proportionally go up, if you do the things that the government is trying to encourage you to do. So if you build a well-designed development that people want to live in, and it's the aspirational place, rather than all of the identikit boxes, the stamp duty that everyone pays goes up, the infrastructure levy goes up, your developer levy goes up, your residential property developer tax goes up. And developers are capitalists, they respond to incentives, and we've created a whole series of incentives to incentivize people to build to the lowest common denominator, and then we decide to try and use the planning system to try and force them to do something different. We should try and set the incentives through the property taxes to encourage people to do the right thing.
Thank you very much for your question. Perhaps we could go to Anya first and then Lord Willetts.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right. We're essentially taxing the things that we want. We want to build more homes, we need more homes, and yet we introduce all of these additional taxation. Then we try and fix all of the problems we create through taxation through the planning system. So it is a huge mess, and this is obviously why the kind of fair share proposals are so beneficial. But yeah, it's a strange situation, right? Because when you get local communities, for instance, lobbying against a development, one of the things they'll often say is there's not enough affordable housing going into it, or whatever, and they'll try and use that as a reason it should be rejected. When obviously many of those people waiting for affordable housing might be saying, well, I'd rather get my 200 units now and get out of whatever horrible situation they're living in than go back to the drawing board and wait another 5 years for the planning process to go through. And it's just interesting that we're kind of taxing that, and we're taxing the potential first-time buyers of that development rather than the local communities as well. It's very much pointing all of the taxation onto the people who have the lowest asset wealth. And I guess it brings us back to what we were talking about earlier about taxing income rather than taxing wealth. It's extremely backwards.
Thank you, Anya. Lord Willetts?
I just want to link what we've just heard, which I thought was a very powerful point, to the sort of identikit issue of lots of standard homes. And often, increasingly, planners say they've got to be for families and not having to mix with smaller properties. Because I think there's another Tory angle on all this, which isn't economics, really, and that is, and I observed this again in my constituency, there's some very interesting evidence. I mean, those family houses will have kids, by and large, and that's what the 2 and 3 bedroom do. There's some very interesting evidence that orderliness in an estate deteriorates sharply if the ratio of children to adults gets beyond a certain amount. And there's some very interesting social science research. So and I observed it happen when a new housing association development happened, and every single house was occupied by children, families with children, and there were over 50% of the occupants of these houses were kids, and the kids were running amok. And I found then that there was a body of research that if you go to, and at some point in the 1970s it even became guidance, don't design your properties in a way that will change the age mix so much. And I think part of the whole intergenerational agenda that interests me is also we want the different ages to mix together. We don't want to live in age-segregated groups. So I think there's an argument that age mix, type of household mix, type of housing mix also contributes to orderly functioning non-anarchic communities.
Thank you very much. Some more questions, please. Can we have this gentleman here?
Thank you. I'd first just like to say I completely concur with everything that was said about stamp duty. It's prohibitive and it blocks the market. My question is around generational ownership. So families that have had a home in their family for hundreds of years, and that property is handed down and incurs inheritance tax. Do the panel think that inherited property is inherently a bad thing? And do they think that their proposals will make inheriting property more difficult? And is that a bad thing?
Let's give that to Erin first. Inherited property, is it a bad thing? Are you going to make it more difficult to inherit property with these reforms?
No, I mean, I think there's clearly some potential interfaces with inheritance tax around this, and this it's a solid proposal as it is, but it would clearly need to talk to Treasury about aspects of it, and there are different tweaks we could make. And we talked about second homes and inheritance tax, and we already treat property differently for inheritance tax, so whether we adjust that, I don't know. Of course, I'm not against inheritance. It's a completely natural thing that people want to do the best for themselves and then the best for their children and pass things on to people. Absolutely. I don't see what we are going to do now is have, as I think Andrew put it earlier, you don't tax the property at the beginning and the end. You tax it. You tax it continually over the lifetime of it, so that people aren't incentivized to move or not move accordingly. And it doesn't follow to me that just because the property's been in your family for 500 years, you deserve different tax treatment to someone striving who's bought themselves up into a similar sort of property. I don't agree with that as a principle, but equally, I don't think this needs to be about inheritance. I think we can work with the nuances that are already there in the inheritance tax system. This is something that applies equally to everybody. It applies to every residential property in the same way, and it's a tax that happens year by year on the stock rather than just on the transactions, and that's how I see it.
Thank you, Erin. If I could just go to Carol on that as well. Inherited property, bad thing?
No. I think what we want is we want more people to be able to own property so that they can bequeath it to their children. I think that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve here, rather than having the huge divide between those who have and can inherit and those who can't and won't. Levelling up is about that. I mean, inheritance tax is a whole nother issue and does need to be simplified, particularly around property. There is a lot of confusion about the extra residential band, but that's a completely different panel, I think.
Thank you, Carol. If we can take some more audience questions, please. This gentleman right here.
Given that a central tenet of this policy is about fairness, I wonder if the panel could comment on a couple of intrinsically unfair parts about the policy. The first is that it's capital structure agnostic, so if two people have the same value house but one has a very large mortgage and the other doesn't, they're clearly not of the same wealth. And the second is, why are we looking to criticise people or disincentivize people from allocating capital to property as opposed to other unproductive assets like gold, fine wine, classic cars, the like?
There's quite a lot of elements to that. So if we could, Anya, if you'd like to go first, then followed by Andrew.
I mean, on the second part, I would like to see people putting their money into productive assets like businesses, as opposed to property, which is what we have, and that is largely incentivised by the continued inflation of house prices. I don't think it's a good thing for people to be, buying up property and to be seeking that over alternative things. Obviously, you've highlighted classic cars. I mean, if people want to spend their money on classic cars, that's their problem, not mine. But certainly, I think there are better ways that we could encourage people to invest their money. And the other thing, actually, is, this is kind of going off topic a little bit, but you often get people talking about property as a retirement investment. And that is, what a lot of people purchase it with the intent of guaranteeing themselves a rental income in the future. I don't think that's a very good thing, because I think it's a very risky investment. We've already seen that if there's some kind of shock, like a coronavirus, for instance, and loads of people leave the centre of London and go elsewhere, rents plummet. Those people are all at extreme risk because they've put all of their eggs in one basket. So again, I think there are better ways that we could encourage people to save for the future than property.
Thank you, Anya. Andrew?
I think you're alluding to some sort of broader wealth tax, and I defer to Aaron, who's definitely a specialist in that field. I would just clarify, though, that council tax is it's a tax on property wealth anyway at the moment, based on 1991 value. So we're sort of in this position now where you can't go to your local authority and say, well, I've got a 95% mortgage, therefore I don't fancy paying the council tax. So that's sort of where I sit down. I hear what you're saying, but I don't think it's enough to say no.
Yeah, and I'll just add, of course, you can't achieve perfect fairness, but your model would itself have perverse effects. It would create an incentive for just borrowing against the value of your home, because you reduce the liability, which I think itself would be undesirable. And part of the Treasury view, I mean, we as Conservatives, a lot of people are nervous about a full-blown wealth tax. And the practical Treasury objection has always been that valuing jewellery kept in someone's cupboard or paintings or whatever is very hard to do. So you can't, the danger of trying to tax wealth is in reality people hide their wealth in some forms that are just very hard for anybody to get at. The advantage of housing, it is out there, it is visible, it's hard to hide a house. So, I think it's just an element of pragmatic Toryism. Yeah, it's reasonable to say this is a great big thing, and there is, of course, a land value issue, which Andrew touched on there. So I don't have a problem with saying that is something that can be taxed, even when some other assets are much harder to tax.
Thank you. I don't know if Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, to really echo some of what both Andrew and David said, I mean, intellectually, you can make a case for a wealth tax as a Tory thing, particularly in light of the increase in wealth in this country relative to incomes. Practically, I think it's incredibly difficult to do. France has one, and raises almost nothing because people know how to avoid it. I think what David said as well about the fact that you just incentivise people to borrow against it if you offset it in that way. Taxation is fundamentally about plucking the plucking the goose with a minimum amount of hissing, and property works quite well for that. And this might not be a perfectly, I think it's much better intellectually from an economist's perspective. It's still not perfect. It's better than what we've got. It's practical. It works, and it's replacing something that is manifestly bad. So let's take a step in the right direction rather than worrying about the absolute ideal.
Thank you, Erin. If we could open up to the floor again. Anyone has a
Have we exhausted them?
question? I think we may have done. Well, I think. Oh yes, sorry, this lady here.
I used to live in Westminster, which is one of the lowest council tax rates and the most expensive property. How is Westminster residents, how are they going to handle this financially?
Badly.
How, I mean, yes, because you've got to... How would you actually propose to deal with that?
Well, you have, as they say, spotted the flaw. The Westminster effect. But there is this protection. I think Andrew was yes about this, but the idea is here, and I have seen different reforms in benefits and taxes go wrong because they didn't have transitional protections. And it seems to me that the fantastic work, and we should pay tribute to this, that Andrew and his group have done, and now Bright Blue have reinforced, is absolutely about transitional protections so that you don't have extreme cases of the sort you're worried about.
Andrew, you'd like to comment on that?
Yeah, that's right. So I think the cap is really key. So no one's going to see an increase of more than £100 a month at the point of transition. I will clarify, though, that that cap falls away upon sale of the property. And the reason for this is because the new buyer has not had to pay stamp duty. So there's a really key nuance here that I think is particularly relevant. So over time, and every 7 years or however many times it takes to move a property over, eventually we'll all be on a PPT. That's the eventual goal. But the transition is smooth. And the other thing we have is the deferral, which I hope will help. Denmark has a deferral system for their property taxes. Actually, interestingly, not many people take up the deferral option. They'd rather just pay it out rather than leaving it to their descendants to pay the bill at the end. So lots of things that we can do there. Very comfortable with where we've got to. And I'm afraid we are, I like the idea that the cap goes away upon sale of property. I think that makes it a lot smoother.
Carol, could you comment on the extent to which you're convinced by the extent to which these protective mechanisms will actually prevent the adverse effects that you mentioned earlier? And very much like this question as well.
And why I think they will?
Do you think that these mechanisms will work? Like, do you think that will, like, we've spoken...
Yes, I think we need, as we've discussed, that we need a transition phase, and this is as good as any way of doing it. I think it is a very good... I was just playing devil's advocate, really, that if you say 1,200, it sounds small, but if you add it up over 10, 20 years, were you to defer it, then it would add up. I don't quite know what was meant by the modest rate of interest that was quoted, but...
Well, I mean, I would just have it at, 30-year treasuries. I mean, I don't think there's any reason to, but I would do the same for student finance debt as well, if I'm honest. So that's for a different group, I think. Yeah,
we definitely need some sort of transition phase. But I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's going to be less popular in Westminster than it is in Hartlepool. For many reasons. Also, many residents in Westminster will be second homeowners, I imagine. We've got pied à terres. Yes.
Anya, there's been a lot of talk about, possibly, do you think that this sort of reforms could draw new, younger voters to the Tory party? But, surely when people think to themselves, I can't afford a house, I can't get on the housing ladder, they don't look at the tax system and go, that's the problem, do they?
I do think it could potentially draw new voters. People don't look at the tax system, but people do respond to the fact that their lives are improving. I'm not saying we should use them as a model, but if you look at countries that have governments that don't change, like Japan and so on, it's because their governments have been able to guarantee fairly decent standards of life for their people across generations. So if you want a permanent conservative majority, you're going to have to deal with the fact that young people are very, very angry about their housing circumstances.
Let's have your question, then we'll have a question from the live stream.
It's related. Basically, one of the problems I think that young people have, who are most of them are paying their rent at a higher level than the mortgage they can obtain. And is this not something that we need to look at the deposit and the banking system and the mortgage system? Because I often have it as a counsellor, we see it quite a lot, where people are paying quite high rents, and actually it's cheaper for them to buy a property, which Berkeley Homes have been making, or buying. Exactly. and there seems this, disconnect between what they're actually paying, and they're physically paying that. They're not defaulting, yet they go to the bank, and the bank say, your affordability is not there at a lower level. Yeah. Absolutely crazy.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. If we could go to Erin and then Anya on that.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. I know the Treasury are looking at there's basically a mismatch in what's available for people in mortgages, because people could afford the initial payments, but they get rightly assessed against a higher potential interest rate in the future. I mean, interest rates certainly aren't going any lower, are they? So people need to be able to keep up, repayments if they go up. But why you can't have longer term fixes, lifetime fixes for mortgages? Okay, the rates will have to be higher. There's risk attached to that, but we have a world-leading financial services sector. Surely it's not beyond the wit of man to design products that actually reflect what people really need, because it's absolutely daft that if you're paying more in rent than in a mortgage. That can't be a good thing for the individual, but it also can't be a good thing for the Conservative Party. Yeah, well, we're looking at changing the regulations around. We're trying to encourage the sector to bring in new products which will be regulated accordingly. But it's absolutely right that you do the affordability test, because interest rates could be, back up to something more normal in 3 or 4 years' time. But if you make a product that actually lasts the lifetime of the mortgage, then the problem falls away.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that kind of deposit barrier is what causes this seeming mismatch between the fact that rents are often more expensive than a mortgage for an equivalent property. I think Erin is right to raise the fact that this is also an issue that we have historically low interest rates, and I would caution against focusing entirely on increasing access to finance, because there is a risk then you create an extremely vulnerable group of people in the event that something happens to interest rates, which is why PricedOut overwhelmingly favours the increasing supply mechanism as opposed to increasing access to credit.
I think this is a really important point, and I agree with what Erin says, and I would actually go a bit further. We are over-regulating mortgages. And I personally think, and maybe my appetite for sort of risk is a bit different, I actually think that the affordability criteria are implausibly tight. We're in an environment where people moving interest rates to 0.5% would be a very big deal, but we have to plan on the basis they're 5% or 6%. This is and it is costing, as Erin rightly said, a lot of money to people who would be rationally taking out a mortgage on the basis of their earnings and any normal, sensibly regulated mortgage system. And if I may add, there's a generational twist to this. We boomers had extremely lax mortgage regulation when we were taking out loans. Let's face it was a scandal pretty much, and people would sign up things. And as boomers have shifted from borrowers to asset holders and net lenders, we have shifted the balance of finance from being soft on borrowers to being tough on borrowers so as to protect the interests of the lenders. And if anything, what is surprising about recent economic turbulence in Britain, is how few repossessions there have been on houses. So I think it is over-regulated. And the final twist, this ties in with the buy-to-let mortgage, because the buy-to-let mortgages are regulated differently. So we boomers have created a mortgage regulatory environment that enables us to buy a second home and let it out, but harder for our kids to buy. We are allowed to take out interest-only mortgages for our second home to lend it out, but we won't let our kids do it. So my view is this is actually quite a serious example of generational unfairness, and it's one of the reasons for the widespread of mom-and-pop landlordism. It's because they have a different mortgage regime which is not permitted to our kids. So I actually do feel quite strongly about this, and I think as well as the supply side, we need to reform what is now a deeply dysfunctional mortgage regulatory system.
Thank you. Very good. I didn't mean to dampen the applause. Well deserved. We've got a few questions coming through from the live stream. So we've got a question from George. So thank you for your question, George. I'm going to give this one to Andrew. Are people really going to tolerate automatic algorithms making contentious decisions about property value?
Great question. Many other countries around the world manage to value properties. I think this country prides itself on AI, data analytics, etc. I see no reason why we can't be the leader in that. In fact, we have commissioned a 200-page document by IPTI, who've done exactly this piece of work. So absolutely, I've a lot of confidence. I think it's something like 85% of properties can be valued within a 5% range. And clearly there's going to be some outliers. Larger properties, smaller niche properties, etc. But on balance, yes, I think. One way of doing it also, by the way, is self-regulate. You say, well, you can declare the value of your property, but if, for example, we think you've undervalued it, we get the right to buy it. Now, I'm not convinced that's the solution, but that's what some people have suggested. I'm not advocating it, but it is possible to do.
Thank you. I've got another question through from Andrew, which asks Lord Willetts to answer, followed by Erin. So, considering the political disincentives mentioned by the panel, could this tax only be implemented by a Labour government?
No, I don't think so. And that's why I thought Aaron's opening remarks were so important, and the new dynamics of the Conservative Party. This is a levelling up proposal. This is, and I don't think people will actually calculate how they're better off down to last pound, but it will help people with their housing costs in less valuable properties, in less affluent parts of the country. I think it will help get housing moving there. It will help get housing traded. It will bring some life to a housing market in a progressive way. So I think it's in the political interests of the Conservative Party as well. I think it makes both economic and political sense.
I mean, it's not a slam dunk for the Labour Party either. I mean, they control a lot of the constituencies with the highest property values, the ones in the cities, which is this new divide as well. So, I think it's something that I will continue to push for, and I know a lot of my Red Bull colleagues are interested in it as well. We've met with Andrew, we've been discussing this with him. It's something that I would like to get further up the agenda, and as the new intake of MPs, the Red Bull seats progress within government, there's fingers crossed. But as we move up within government, I think those opinions will be heard more clearly. I mean, we will lobby the Chancellor about these sorts of things anyway, but we are still transitioning as a parliamentary party as well as our national coalition. And the genius of the Conservative Party is its capacity to reinvent itself, over centuries. And I think this is another opportunity to do that. And as I said at the beginning, I don't want Labour to beat us to the punch. They might, but I think it's not a slam dunk for them either.
Thank you. I'm interested to get your opinions on that as well, Anya and Carol. I mean, do you think it's more realistic that only really a Labour government will be able to implement this in any kind of near time frame? Anya.
Labour government in a near time frame. No, I don't think so. I don't see any reason why the Conservative Party couldn't do this, and especially when they have a very large majority. And actually, I think this is a policy that does attract pretty widespread support from anyone who listens and thinks about it. Obviously, Westminster is going to be its own issue, but as we said earlier, that there are always going to be winners and losers. And in this case, I think the losers can probably afford it, and it won't really harm their quality of life in a massive way. So it's worth doing, and I think the Conservatives can do it.
Thank you, Anya. Carol?
I agree with Anya. I think the Conservatives are going to have to do it. I do think there's...
no choice.
I do think there's a Labour government about to happen.
Before we go to another question from the live stream, are there any questions that we have in the audience? Yes, let's have it definitely again.
Hi, just because it was mentioned by someone else, in terms of mortgages, I absolutely agree with everything that Lord Willetts said about the unfairness of the way it's been set up. But there's actually another increasing problem with the mortgage market, which is the length of time you can have a firm mortgage offer for. Because if you're building big blocks of flats, you're at risk for the entire cost as soon as you start pouring foundations. So you have to pre-sell it 18 months, 2 years out. And as an owner-occupier, you can't get a firm mortgage when you sign on the dotted line and hand over your life savings for a deposit. So if you happen to lose your job for 3 months, say, 2 years down the line, you then lose all your life savings. So people can't take that risk, which is why you end up with a situation where they get sold to foreign investors and owner-occupiers, because they're the only ones that can take that sort of risk. So if you're in the process of talking to mortgage lenders about how they should look at the market, that is a key area in which you can level the playing field for owner-occupiers and, move away from some of these foreign investors owning a lot of London.
Lord Willetts, would you like to come in on that first?
Well, yes, first of all, that is a new angle. I was not aware of that point. Very interesting. And it all ties in with the wider narrative. But thanks. Very, very, I'm sorry, I hadn't spotted it before. Very good.
Aaron, do you have any thoughts?
No, I mean, likewise, thank you for that extra nuance. I mean, I don't have too many foreign direct investors flying off plan in Newcastle on the Line, but yet, once we've levelled up, it will be we'll be beating them away. But no, it just goes to show that regulation, and in all the ways that David talked about, regulation ends up being shaped by the people who have an interest in shaping it that way. I mean, that's not a criticism of what's happened in the past, but that's. We have to start rebalancing all of our regulation, all of our tax system to try and be fairer intergenerationally and to the regions. And that's an extra angle I wasn't aware of particularly, so thank you for raising it.
Got another question through from Nina. So thank you, Nina, for that question. So I'll probably go to you again, Aaron, but I'm actually interested in all the panel's opinion on this. Is this tax a levelling up tax?
No, I don't see it explicitly as a levelling up tax. I mean, I think it's a good idea in its own right. I think we have a very distorted property taxation model. I think we have a very distorted housing market. We've ended up putting far too much of our wealth into housing, and it hasn't gone into investment. It hasn't gone into businesses. It hasn't gone into creating better jobs and better skills for people. Now, I'm not proposing we pull the plug on the housing market because I think that would probably might get us that Labour government. But I think it makes sense in its own right. But I think for levelling up as well and for putting more money in the pockets of people in towns like mine, that's an additional benefit. And levelling up is what this government is here to do. It's why we got elected. I mean, we got elected, obviously, Brexit and Corbyn, but the other thing people said to me on the doorstep in 2019 is, town's not what it was. It needs a lick of paint, or it needs quite a bit more than a lick of paint. And we can do that with buildings, and we can do that with towns funds and all the rest of it, but we also need to make sure that the incentives for people to get the right property, to get onto the property ladder themselves, we've got to make sure those are right as well, and this does do that.
Thank you, Aaron. Andrew.
Yeah, I did see that Andy Burnham described it as a levelling up tax. I mean, I don't think it's a levelling up tax. I think it's the right thing for a country as a whole. I don't think it should be seen as north versus south, etc. So I do see this the right thing. And I think the other thing is it delivers on Michael Gove's and Neil O'Brien's key 4 priorities. So that's how I would frame it. If the end goal is levelling up, fantastic. But I wouldn't call it a tax on levelling up.
Well, thank you, but that is, I think, where we sort of have to draw it to a close. I mean, thank you very much to our panellists for some very thoughtful answers to a wide range of questions. Thank you to our audience, both physical and virtual. And also thank you very much to Fairer Share for partnering with us on this event.
Fantastic. Thank you.